A few more people may want to slink in to this ThinkIn, but we'll get started. Thank you all very much for coming. My name's Giles. I'm an editor here. And I want to start diving right in to read a few lines from Martin Rees's most recent book. I'm going to change one word in this, and you'll have to guess what it is. More should be done to assess and then minimize, he writes, the probability of global hazards. We live under their shadow, and they're raising the stakes for humanity. The issues impel us to plan internationally. Brackets. For instance, whether or not a pandemic gets global grip may hinge on how quickly a Chinese poultry farmer can report any strange sickness. Can anyone guess what the one word I changed was? Did you say unless? No, it was Vietnamese. I mean, it was Chinese. I substituted Chinese for Vietnamese, but otherwise prescient in every detail. This book is by turns terrifying and uplifting. It's a large hadron collider of ideas, which is really what ThinkIn is supposed to be as well. So for those of you who haven't been to a ThinkIn, very briefly, it's an opportunity for you all to speak as well as listen. It's modeled on a newspaper leader conference, but there are many more of you here with a much larger sum of knowledge, I'm sure, than in any leader conference that I've attended. We are recording it, we are filming it, we are live streaming it. But it's intimate enough for you all to feel relaxed about saying whatever's on your mind. The yellow stripe following the tortoise across the screen is a clock. When it gets to the end, the flag will go up, and we're done. And that will be in an hour. But please, as James and my other co-host always emphasize, raise your hand and pitch in sooner rather than later, because otherwise we end up with everybody suddenly wanting to talk with only 5 minutes still to go. So the standard ThinkIn has more than one guest speaker. This is non-standard just in the sense that we have only one, but we don't need any more. Lord Rees, Martin Rees, is, I'm just going to read out some of his job descriptions. In reverse order, co-founder for the study of existential risk. He is a professor. Are you still a professor of cosmology at Cambridge? Once a professor. Oh, yes. And Astronomer Royal, which even for an ardent Republican like me is somehow an impossibly romantic and singular job title. Now, I'm going to plug this book once more. On the Future was published 2 years ago now. 20 years. Since when climate anxiety, if I can call it that, has reached a new peak? The Iran nuclear deal has more or less gone down the tubes. We have the coronavirus outbreak from central China. And we have Brexit looming in a few days' time, an example, if ever there was one, of declining rather than increasing international cooperation. So I suppose my first question has to be, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, too many things, I have to say. I think, to be honest, it's mainly the misuse of powerful new technology. One new feature of the world is that there are technologies, particularly bio and cyber, which can be used and understood by millions of people, don't require large conspicuous facilities like nuclear activities do, and are going to be very hard to control. And whatever regulations we have on the use of these things, bioethics and all that, enforcing those rules globally is as hopeless as enforcing the drug laws globally or the tax laws globally. And so I worry about the societal impact of things like that. But that doesn't mean I don't worry about climate and population and events like that. And I should perhaps put in point at the start that I'm a rotten forecaster. So I was Astronomer Royal, and people sometimes asked, does that mean you do the Queen's horoscopes? I say, well, she's never asked, but I'm the man she'd asked if she did. But I have to say that scientists are really rotten forecasters, almost as bad as economists. So apply that sort of discount factor to anything I say.
But I've just picked you up as a forecaster. You did a fantastic job of forecasting the latest sort of proto-pandemic out of China. But you do also write quite a lot about, as you say, bio-terror risk as well as bio-error risk. And whereas we've seen these killer virus outbreaks from Asia, and we've seen the cyber menace that you talk about more or less in the same breath. Can you say a little bit more about what you worry about in the bio-terror as opposed to error category?
Yes, well, to give a quote of two examples, in 2011, scientists showed it was possible to make the flu virus both more virulent and more transmissible. And these so-called gain-of-function experiments were scary enough that the American federal government stopped funding them. And so this is the kind of technology which is now widespread. And of course, we now have the CRISPR technique for gene editing, which can be misused. And so these technologies are widely spread. They don't need any very elaborate equipment. It doesn't exist in a university lab. And it would just take a few weirdos to cause catastrophe with them. And ditto, of course, for cyber, because we know very well that just a lone person can cause massive disruption via cyber. And, of course, a state-level cyber attack is even worse. In fact, I quote in my book a report from the American Defense Department in 2012, where they talk about a possible state-level attack on the electricity grid in the eastern United States. And they say, I quote, this would merit a nuclear response. It's not a rather scary concept. And I think, if I can just go on for a moment, that what is especially worrying is how fragile society is to these things. We know clearly that if the power went down in London, there would be complete anarchy and shambles within 2 or 3 days. I think that's clear. And, of course, if we have a pandemic, whether a natural one or a engineered one, then it's not like the Middle Ages when the Black Death killed half the population, the other half went on fatalistically. Once the number of cases overwhelmed hospitals, then there'd be a breakdown in social order from people clamoring for more attention. And that could happen before the number of cases reached even 1%. So I think because our expectations are so high, because we're all interconnected and not just in our villages, then the whole of society is more fragile. And to quote another example, there's a well-known book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, where he talked about the collapse of 5 particular societies. And I think the sort of collapse that I'm talking about, some sort of mega disaster, it would cascade globally. We're so interconnected, supply chains, internet and everything else, that it couldn't affect one country, or even one continent, without affecting the rest of the world. So it's those sorts of things, the runaway consequences of some act making use of powerful technology, which worry me most.
Yes.
Hi.
What's your name?
Good evening. So what's your opinion about the war?
Can I, sorry, I could, first of all, can I ask you your name? And second of all, can I say something that did I say before about the no questions? No. All right. I should say that ordinarily we have a no questions rule, which doesn't mean don't say what's on your mind. It means the contrary, do say what's on your mind, but if possible, not as a question. It just means that it doesn't demand a response. But on this occasion, I will be flexible about the application of that rule. And, whether I apply it or not depends on the quality of the question. But go ahead, tell me your name.
What's your opinion of the Huawei situation then?
I don't think I know enough to comment. So that helps you out.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
Sorry, could I make a comment?
Yes.
Yes, please. Can you tell me your name?
Kevin McManus.
Yep.
As someone who grew up during the age of mature, assured destruction.
Yes.
As a sort of, yeah, I suppose we were entered secondary school and it was still a real goer.
Yeah.
And our greatest hope was when the 4-minute warning sounded, was at least to be at home so we could, as a family, we could be under the table together. But that did, and notwithstanding the BBC film, I forget the name of it now, was banned, but notwithstanding that, and we all believed that it was credible, maybe as children, I don't know what the adults thought, there wasn't a breakdown in society.
Well, it didn't, no, because it didn't happen. But I think if I could add a footnote to what you said, if we do look back, those of us who are ancient here and recall the Cold War, if we read the reminiscences of McNamara and people like that, and we learn about the false alarms, then the statement that Kennedy made at the time of the Cuba crisis, that it was between 1 in 3 and evens that we'd have a disaster, and McNamara said we survived through luck rather than good judgment, then that does mean that we were indeed lucky. And I think if you ask the thought experiment, were you really happy with a policy where the risk of destroying the fabric of Europe and North America was between 1 in 3 and 1 in 6, say? I don't think we would have been happy at that high risk. I certainly would not have accepted a 1 in 3, even a 1 in 6 risk of that happening, even if the alternative was a certain Soviet takeover of Western Europe. And I think it was, if we knew then just how risky it was, I don't think we would have been so resigned to it.
It's a really interesting line in the book. Yes, in just a second. I wonder how many people. It hadn't occurred to me that we might have faced such a stark choice between nuclear Armageddon and a period of Soviet control. How many people would rather that the requisite submarine commanders press the button prompting a nuclear exchange, or a generation, perhaps 2, perhaps 3, of Soviet control? People in favour of mutually assured destruction? Thanks. And in favour of rubbing along with the Soviets for a bit? It's a good point. Was one allowed to think like that during the Cold War?
Well, but most people didn't. Because I think they didn't realise how high the probability was of something going wrong by error, if not by design. And of course, things aren't quite as dangerous now, because the chance of some nuclear weapons going off now is probably higher than ever in the Middle East or India, Pakistan or something like that. But of course, the number is much less. In the time of the Cold War, the number on each side of nuclear warheads was 50,000 plus. Now it's about 6,000 on each side. And so the risk of such a catastrophic disaster for the world is now in abeyance. But of course, it may just be temporary in abeyance. We could imagine a new stand-up between new superpowers in the second half of this century, which could be handled less well or less luckily than the Cuba crisis was. So I think we need to be scared about nuclear, even though, as I say, we've got these new kinds of threats to worry about.
I should say that the book, and I think your worldview, allows for optimism as well as dismay, and perhaps we can make a point of getting to some reasons to be cheerful before the hour is out. But David.
So Martin, thank you very much for your book and for your articles. They've been very inspiring over the years. Could I just briefly talk about the methodology for thinking about the future? Because things like infections and meteorites hitting us, you can't model these things. The infection one is very difficult to predict. It is, of course, we understand it once it begins. But those of us trying to build global models, we can only rely on one thing, and that's, as Pinker says, it's trendable things that are happening. And the 3 trendable things that stick out in every global model, I'm sure you know them. Their population, we will plateau around 2050. Climate change, which Tortoise is really making progress on. But the other one, which I'm interested to hear your view on, which comes out so clearly, but of course is counterintuitive, is that by 2050, we seriously have most substances, natural materials, on the extinction list. Things like lead, which you think is everywhere, has an extinction. You know, you have extinction for animals, you have extinction for metals. It disappears in 38. Antimony in 34. Cheap crude oil is almost certainly gone by 35. So I'm very interested to hear what you think about the third issue, which is we're running out of the stuff as well, and what tensions that might create.
Well, I just have a slight proviso that people talked about peak oil happening, and it didn't happen because they searched more deeply for it. But certainly you're right that we do have to worry not just about resources of plants and animals, mass extinction, etc., but we do need to worry about the finite supply of certain important rare earths for a high-tech economy. I personally don't rate that very high on my list of concerns, because we would surely recycle all the stuff in batteries and things like that if it became really scarce. So it is a thing to worry about, and another reason why we should go slow on certain technologies, but I don't think it's going to be quite so serious.
David, is it your understanding that...
I mean, just go on for
Yeah,
another
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, only one thing I would chip in, Giles, is to say it's most important. Crude oil is so important to us. You must put the adjective in front of it. It's cheap.
Yes.
It's really important, because if you look at that stuff, it really has gone by 35.
Yes, but of course, are you saying that we can't possibly have a carbon zero economy? Because that's the aspiration, of course, isn't it?
Yeah, I doubt that very much. But I think I'm a big sort of climate change person, so I think we'll get close to it. The disaster is if we try to cut fossil fuels off now. That would
Well, we can't cut them too fast, but I think the optimistic situation is that we can have renewable energy, which I think would include nuclear. I think without nuclear, it's going to be very hard to provide baseload. And I think we also have to bear in mind we need more electricity if you want to make all transport electric powered. And also, we've got to accept that long-distance aviation can never be battery powered, and so we've got to use some electricity to use electrolysis to get hydrogen, for instance, to power aircraft. So we need a huge increase in the amount of electricity if we're going to have the kind of carbon-free economy people talk about. And that electricity has to be either renewables or nuclear.
I'll come to you in a second. Yes, what's your name?
Hi, my name is Chris MacDonald. So I run an industrial research institute which is looking at the hydrogen economy. It's really interesting to hear you say that. And the points about resource efficiency as well are very important for many of the companies that we work with. But I wonder whether, going back to your point about existential risk, whether we take that seriously in terms of sovereign capability. So you mentioned about recycling of materials and so on, and energy supply. We import currently nearly 40% of our electricity from overseas, and so I wonder whether we really take that seriously as a kind of an.
You mean for the UK to be self-sufficient? You mean?
I'm not necessarily saying the UK to be self-sufficient, but in terms of having a robust economy, it's more. My view would be that it's naive to rely on the fact that you can continue on a transactional basis if indeed those transactions are vital for continuing society. Society could break down so quickly if you lost the energy or the materials, for instance.
Yes, I mean, I think there's got to be enough energy to keep the economy going and the transport system going on a global scale, I think.
Yes, what's your name?
Mark Cripps.
Yeah.
Risk to me is infinite, and I have to express risk and articulate risk at work. How do you structure the investigation of risk and the exploration of risk?
That's a question. It is a question. I'll allow it.
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously, to take a topical example, the WHO is doing precisely that in the context of this recent epidemic. So obviously in particular cases you can make a show of it, but when you think of the unexpected, you can't. And going back to an earlier point that was raised, I think we've got to distinguish between risks where we know something about the probability, and I would say asteroids or something like that. People, when they know an astronomer, they say, are you worried about asteroid risks? And I say not very much, because we know what the number of asteroids is and what the probability is of impacts of different sizes, and more important, we know that that probability is not changing with time. On the other hand, the kind of risks that I do worry about are those which are caused by us, caused by technology, and the annual probability is rising. And they're the ones we need to worry about. And when we're talking about events which are very, very serious, such that even one occurrence is too much, then of course there's a risk of complacency, because in the case of, say, when we buy fire insurance on our house, we know our house isn't likely to burn down, but we know lots of other houses have burned down. So we have an assessment of the risk. But when we're talking about something which would be a disaster for the whole country, or even the whole world, then it's very hard to estimate it. And it's rather like, you know, if the stock market is kept on going up steadily, don't worry about the sudden falls. And likewise, if we've gone on for a number of years without a particular kind of catastrophe happening, then we tend to get rather complacent, because we tend to underestimate the probability of those.
I'd like to drag the conversation towards politics, if you don't mind. You've come straight from the House of Lords, you're a crossbench peer, so you presumably can have learned to expect that. But you've written, actually this is a quote from Jean-Claude Juncker, "We all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it." and that echoes in your own writing in frequent references to frustration about the gap between status quo and where we need to get to, and it's a gap that we talk about often in ThinkIns. Yeah. Is our political system, as currently structured, up to the challenge?
Well, it's difficult, but I'm not completely pessimistic. It's certainly true that politicians worry about the short term and the parochial and what happened before the next election, rather than something global. They don't care so much about what happens 20 years ago to people in remote parts of the world. We understand that. And I also know a lot of people who've been political advisors to government and ministries, and they get frustrated because the politicians don't have much time to divert from urgent problems to think about these. But I think there are two things that have to happen. One is that the public have to make their voice heard, because politicians don't have to take notice of a particular scientific expert in their ministry, but they do care about what's in their inbox and what's in the press. So in the context of things like climate and mass extinctions and all that, then the fact that there are these protests, especially by young people, is certainly keeping these issues high on the agenda. And I think this is a way in which we can ensure that they're at least not forgotten by the politicians. And they also need to know that the voters are, in general, behind certain actions. And I'd like to give two examples. One in climate change, which is a rather surprising one. I'm going to praise the Pope, because there was in 2014 a big conference at the Vatican with the leading climate scientists and also economists like Stiglitz and Sachs, which produced a report on climate and the environment, which was input into the papal encyclical in 2015, which was a few months before the Paris conference in December of that year. And the Pope got a standing ovation at the UN, and it certainly eased the path to consensus at that conference, that the billion Catholics in Latin America, Africa, and East Asia all realized that it was an important issue, and this was the first time a Pope had actually said explicitly that humans have a responsibility to the rest of creation. And so that's a case where the public was influenced by one charismatic figure. And on a rather minor scale, what has happened here, I mean, I don't think many of us would regard Michael Gove as a particularly sort of charismatic or inspirational person, but the fact that he introduced legislation to ban non-reusable drinking straws and such like, he did that because he knew he wouldn't lose votes. And the reason he knew that was that there'd been the David Attenborough programs, Blue Planet 2, which showed in particular the iconic image of the albatross returning to its nest and coughing up for its young, not the expected nourishment, but some bit of plastic. And that's an iconic image, rather like the polar bear on the melting ice floe is for the climate campaign. And for that reason, because of the Attenborough program, the problem of plastics in the ocean is now quite high on the agenda. It wasn't anything we were aware of, I would say, 3 years ago. And that's an example where public opinion has been shifted by a charismatic person, maybe Attenborough, and charismatic images. And so that's the reason I'm not completely pessimistic, because I think the public can be converted to care about these issues. And although if you're in business and putting up a factory or office building, then you discount the future, so you give no weight to what happens after 2050. Anyone who's got a baby knows that he or she ought to be alive in the 22nd century, and so is not prepared to discount the future. So I'm not completely hopeless about long-term issues rising up on the agenda. But if I can just say one other thing about the climate issue, because this was in the House of Lords debate. I think that, going back to what was said earlier about fossil fuels, if we are to have a carbon-free economy, we do need technical advances. We need cheaper batteries and more efficient things. We probably need a grid to take solar energy from the sunny south to the north, and maybe to smooth over time zones, ideally all the way from Spain to China on the Belt and Road. That would be wonderful to have that. So we need lots of technology. And I think politicians in this country ought to prioritize R&D into clean energy and all the things that go with it in this country. The reason is we're certainly going to need it if we are to achieve our claimed targets for 2050. We're going carbon neutral by then. And there's another reason, which is that if we meet those targets, it's neither here nor there for the world, because we're at 1% of the world's emissions. But where I would claim at least 10% of the world's clever ideas. So if we can develop some new technology which allows clean energy to be generated more cheaply, and therefore allows India to leapfrog directly to clean energy and not build coal-fired power stations, we'll thereby not only help our own economy, but make more than 1% difference to the world's CO2 emissions, if developing countries can be given the technology that enables them to move directly to carbon-free economy. So I think this should be a government priority to accelerate this R&D, because there's also nothing more inspirational for young engineers than to aim to provide clean and affordable energy for the developing world as well as for us.
Right. Comments rather than questions, if possible, please starting just behind you, sir, with the dark hair. Yeah. What's your name?
Angus Mercer. Hi, Lord Rees. Just setting up a think tank now that focuses on issues affecting future generations, and it feels like long-termism is having a bit of a moment at the moment, not just through the media, as you said, through Attenborough, through a book in March that's coming out, Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, on existential risk. I'm wondering how that does translate into politics. If you look at the legislation that's come out since January, we've got an environment bill dealing with air pollution. You've got a bill on automation and facial recognition software. We've got a future generations bill from your fellow peer, Lord Bird. I'm wondering whether there are any other bits of low-lying fruit that you see for a government that's in this rare position of a majority. They can get things done. They don't just have to look to its existential threat of Brexit 2 weeks from now. They can afford to take a slightly longer view. And I'm wondering what, in your eyes, is the low-lying fruit that's there for the taking.
Because the trouble is most of these issues need to be attacked on a larger scale than a single small nation like ours, you know, at least the EU, if not wider. And so I'm slightly pessimistic about it being more than gesture politics if we in this country have some proclamation about future generations. I don't think we can do very much. I think it's got to be global, or at least on a continental scale, if we are to have much effect. But nonetheless, as I said earlier, anything which raises these items on the agenda so they feature more in the press and politicians are aware that voters care about them are all to the good.
What do you, have you got any low hanging fruit that you think the government should be pursuing, pulling off?
The future generations bill certainly seems like it has legs. There's this interesting distinction.
I should know what's in the bill.
So a variety of things, but its centrepiece really is the creation of a future generations commissioner. This role already exists in Wales, and it essentially is a governance structure that would require one person to view all future legislation through the prism of its impact on future generations. So this is already a thing in Wales, and it's coming to the. I think it had its first reading in the Lords earlier in January, so it's a live bill at the moment.
And there's a manifesto commitment.
It's not
No, it's a private member's bill.
Oh, right.
It's a private member's bill.
By in fact, Lord John Bird. He's the founder of Big Issue. And you know him, do you? He's a splendid character.
I do.
Yes.
He's running a campaign through the paper at the moment.
Yes, and I remember his maiden speech in the House of Lords, where he said, "I first want to thank my probation officer," because he was sent to a remand home when he was a kid and all that.
But do you sense that this has sufficient buy-in from the government to
Well, I don't know, but I mean, I think I support it for the reason that consciousness-raising thing, just like what bishops say, etc. But I think it's not more than just a tweaking of the balance of the arguments, in my opinion. But good luck, and if other countries did the same thing, and of course a few did, I think Hungary had someone, and one of the Scandinavian countries, then it might make some difference. But I say anything that makes us think in a longer-term way and not discount everything on the standard economic 3 or 5% per year is a good thing. And incidentally, the one the one context where policy does accept an essentially zero discount rate is in radioactive waste disposal, where they talk with a straight face about the repository being safe for 10,000 or even 1 million years. And that's rather ironical when they can't really plan energy policy even 30 years ahead.
Yes, and then we'll come to you.
I was just going to make...
What's your name?
Sorry, James. I was going to make a slightly provocative statement, hopefully invite a response rather than ask a question.
Go ahead.
I thought the straw example was a good one in that I thought David Attenborough's documentaries were extremely emotional and evocative, yet the main output of that is straws being banned. So from now on people might have to use a different utensil, or God help us actually drink from a cup. So I feel like the impact that that's had on people's lives is almost zero. So people are willing to support that kind of thing, whereas I look at something which I would say is equally simple, like vegetarianism. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a very good argument against vegetarianism, and I think most people pressed on the matter, myself included, continue to eat meat, despite the fact that I think we all know there's many negative consequences. So is it not the case that actually people just don't care enough, and people are inherently selfish about these things?
Well, they are, but I think it's true that we have to arrange that it's not a tremendous hardship to do the kind of things that are right for the planet. And of course, as you know, artificial meat is being discussed, and that's a really benign technology if one can make stuff with the taste of meat and actually made from the same cells as meat is, which doesn't involve animals. So I think there can be moves in this direction. I agree with you that people aren't going to undertake anything that involves them in personal hardship for the benefit of unspecific people in different parts of the world 20 years hence. I agree with that. But I think we can make it easier for them if we develop the right technology.
James, you've been very patient, and I'll come to you.
So I'm James Harding, I'm a fellow editor of Giles here and co-founder of Tortoise. Martin, I wanted to tease you out a little bit about space and about humans in space. So I was born in 1969, quite a good year in terms of humans in space. And I remember in the late 90s, I went to my editor and tried to pitch the idea of being a space correspondent for the paper. And the editor said, that's great, but there are just no stories. And the problem is that the editor was actually right. In the course of the last 50 years, one of the things that's odd about humankind is how little we seem to have done, given what a good start we'd made in '69. And now, where you are seeing people make the running in space, it's very unclear to what end, whether or not it's sort of tourism or bragging rights. And I wondered whether or not you could just help us understand a little bit of what you think in the coming 50 years we might hope to do in space or learn from space.
Very good point. Of course, the high point of manned space flight was the moon landing, Neil Armstrong's one small step, which was just over 50 years ago now. But remember, that was done as an element of superpower rivalry, and it took 4% of the US federal budget at its peak. NASA's budget is now 0.6%. So having beaten the Russians to the moon, there was no reason on grounds of national prestige for the Americans to continue further. And certainly, I mean, I'm old enough to have remembered that event and looked up to it as a futuristic event. And I thought at the time that since it was only 12 years from the first Sputnik to men on the moon, it would only be another 10 years before there were people on Mars. And of course, as we know, no one's even been back to the moon. So you've got to be middle-aged to remember when men walked on the moon, which is a slight difference from my generation. But of course, space has, of course, burgeoned, unmanned space, which depend on every day for communications, climate monitoring, and navigation and all the rest of it. And of course, unmanned space probes have been hugely important in exploring the solar system and the universe. So space has developed. But the point is that as miniaturization and robotics have improved, the practical need for people has gone down. And that is why, indeed, there's no compelling case for sending people at public expense into space. Now, looking ahead to the next 50 years, of course, one thing that we have seen is these private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, run by American multi-billionaires, using the latest technology. And they are talking about sending people into space. And they're really going to be able to do this because, first of all, they're doing Silicon Valley type technology, so which is probably more advanced than conglomerates like Lockheed Martin that did NASA's. But I think the other point is that they can send people into space and accept a higher risk. The Americans, of course, did send hundreds of people into low Earth orbit to the space station, and they launched the shuttle 135 times. And there were 2 failures. And each of those failures was a big trauma in America and delayed the program for 3 years. There were 7, there was a woman school teacher who was killed and all that. And they tried very hard to reduce the risk below 2%, over at 135. And that was very hard. So I think we have to accept that space is going to be dangerous. It's not going to be routine tourism, and the word space tourism, I think, should be avoided. But space adventure, the kind of people who go hang gliding in Yosemite and do other crazy things, going into space and accepting a 10% risk, that can be done. If I was an American taxpayer, I wouldn't support any NASA money being spent on a manned space program, which would be very expensive because it has to be so risk averse. But I cheer on these private companies, and I think they will allow people to go to the moon and even to Mars. Maybe the first people to go to Mars will go with a one-way ticket, but there will be people who will be willing to do that. And Musk himself has said that he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And I think he might make this. And so I think, if you ask for my scenario for the next 50 years, I think there will be not very much manned space flight funded by NASA or ESA, because robots can do the job better and cheaper. But I hope that some of these bold pioneers will, in fact, end up producing a small sort of colony of people on Mars. But I disagree with Musk and with my late colleague Stephen Hawking, in that I think it's a dangerous delusion to ever imagine mass migration to Mars, because Mars is a very hostile environment. It's far more hostile than the top of Everest or the South Pole. And to say that we should go to Mars to avoid the problems of climate change is crazy, because dealing with climate change is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. So there's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. We've got to stay and cherish the Earth. But on the other hand, I think that we should cheer on these pioneers who will go to Mars. You know, modern equivalents of Sir Ranulph Fiennes and people like that are prepared to take these things. And indeed, they will be important in cosmic history, perhaps, because going back to the new technologies, if they're trying to live on Mars, they'll have every motive to adopt all the techniques of genetic modification and cyborg technology, which we'll have developed in the next 50 years. One hopes that those are going to be regulated here on Earth, and of course we've got less incentive, but they've got every incentive to modify themselves to adapt to this alien environment. So those guys out there will evolve into a new species.
I wanted to ask you about this, because you do write about it. You talk about a robotic diaspora, or maybe that's my shorthand.
Yes.
And I wasn't quite clear if this is robots carrying with them a more advanced form of intelligence than our own,
yes.
Or, as you say, an evolved human species with plugins or something.
Yes.
But you said that either way it would be, quote, of cosmic significance.
Yes.
Is that because they're bound eventually to bump into alien civilizations, or why?
Well, I mean, first, they'll be probably different from humans. Whether they'll be flesh and blood or entirely electronic, I don't know. But if they were electronic, then they wouldn't want to be on the planet at all. They wouldn't need an atmosphere. They might prefer zero-G, so they wouldn't want to stay on Mars. And if they were near immortal, then an interstellar voyage wouldn't daunt them. And so if these intelligences, which are in some sense our descendants, evolved from us, not by doing evolution, but by a sort of secular intelligent design, as it were, they will go off into the blue yonder and into interstellar space. Of course, if there are no aliens out there, then they will eventually populate the rest of the galaxy. And of course, whether they'll encounter any aliens, that's a separate question, which is the number one question people ask me when they know I'm an astronomer. Are we alone?
Of course, Musk's original Red Roadster is heading out there now. There's a good mixture of...
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, yes.
My name's Matt Honorich. You can have a go at spelling however you feel.
Matt?
Yeah. Matt's easy enough.
Yeah.
The C, Honorich. Don't worry about that. Sadly, you've moved on to space and aliens. And
that's all right. We can...
No, we go back.
Loop back.
No, go back.
Slightly back to Route 1. But I live in Copenhagen. I've been living there for 3 years. And I just think that it was kind of a return point to the idea about the best situation being a majority. And of course, the biggest problem with the majority is you're incentivized to keep it. And what we have in Denmark is a system of coalition politics, which is kind of seen as this, in the UK at least, as this like problematic stopgap. But actually what it ends up being is a bunch of people who are in power, out of power, on either sides at various points, but sort of get to vote on individual bills based on their conscience, cross the aisle all the time. It seems like a system where long-term planning is much more... I mean, it helps they all agree on things like cycling and taxes and rye bread and anti-immigration. But broadly, it's helpful that they kind of can. It doesn't seem like the election cycle is such a big deal as it is in a country like ours, where we have these big. Yeah. So just kind of a point on.
No, it's an interesting.
Yes. Well, I mean, I say that's a very enviable system, and I think that we ought to move that way. And I mean, I think Corbyn was berated for saying he wants to turn this country into Venezuela. But in fact, what he was really trying to do is to make it close to the Scandinavian countries, which accept a higher rate of tax in return for a proper welfare state, etc. And so I think the Scandinavian countries are top of the happiness index and all that, and provide a good welfare state. So I think we could learn from them. And of course, maybe the fact that the coalition politics has existed, although it's certainly under threat at the moment, I think, is a positive thing. So the Scandinavian countries, I think, have more to teach us in this country than the United States does. And sadly, our government seems to fetishize low tax rates and the American attitudes.
It is a point worth noting, isn't it, that Denmark is a small country, we're relatively small, but some of the big countries are run by, let's say the words, people like Trump, Putin, Bolsonaro, Xi, Erdogan. Yes. It may be a subject for another evening, but I do wonder sometimes whether the quality of leadership at this particular juncture, as existential risks rise, is not up to it.
I agree it is not up to it, but of course China at least has the advantage that it can sort of control these risks better. Right. I think, you know, if we talk, since we're in a sort of media company at the moment, I mean, I defer to all the people here who know far more about the media, but I think that there is not just a transient concern, but a reversible concern about the effect of social media, because until the advent of social media, most people got their news filtered through professional journalists in some way, the newspapers and radio stations, which sort of muffled and filtered out the most crazy kinds of extremism. Whereas, of course, now all that stuff gets unfiltered to a very wide audience. And, of course, if you click on something extreme, you get sent something even more extreme. So I think the advent of social media is one of the things which is making it harder for the middle ground politics, the sort of Scandinavian model, to survive. And I don't think this is transient. I don't quite see how we can get back to a system where the extremes get sort of muffled and we strive for consensus more.
Challenge of uninventing social media. Come to it in a second, but yes, did you have your hand up earlier?
Yeah, yes. James Bacon. I was actually going to make a similar point to you about the prospects for cooperation on existential risk when it seems to me you have in these emerging economies and future superpowers. I wouldn't necessarily put it down to purely the personality of the leadership, but the nature of the political systems, which all seem to have embraced hyper-nationalism. And it seems to me this is the time, these are the crucial decades when we do need international cooperation on climate and on other existential issues. And do you realistically, see any prospects for making, meaningful international agreements on issues of existential risk? And and what can we do to make that more likely?
Well, I think there are models. I mean, we've got International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, etc. And we may need a similar organization to monitor cuts in carbon emissions in different countries. So it shouldn't be hopeless. I mean, there's a special problem, I think, in regulating the internet, because the companies are global, and so it's very hard for any jurisdiction, even on the level of the whole of Europe, to have much effect. So I think there are problems there, but I think we've got to try.
Yes.
My name's Simon. This man with the difficult surname took us back to politics. I hope you don't mind then that I take us back even a step further to the concept of disease. I've always been fascinated by the idea raised in the academic text Inferno by Dan Brown, the idea that actually a widespread sort of disease that covers the Earth could actually be good for the long-term sort of sustainability of our planet. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that without making it a question.
So is that because it cuts the population drastically?
Exactly.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think just a word about population. It's now globally 7.7 billion, and the projections suggest it's going to rise to about 9 by mid-century. And that's a fairly robust projection because most of the people in the world are young, they've got longer life expectancies, they should be alive there, and they haven't yet had children, etc. But beyond 2050, there's a huge spread in projections. And there are some which project that the birth rate will fall globally to what it is in Singapore and Italy and places, and the population will go down again. But there are others which predict that the population will keep on rising, and especially in Africa, because Africa is the one place where the demographic transition hasn't happened in rural sub-Saharan Africa anyway. And there's a UN scenario where the population of Africa will double between now and 2050, but double again between 2050 and 2100, from 2 billion to 4 billion. And at that time, Nigeria would have a population of 900 million, equal to that of Europe and North America combined. Now, this is a sort of dystopian scenario for all those people in Africa. And so I'm sure there should be all possible efforts made to help Africa avoid that situation, because that would be bad. And I think most of us agree that the ideal global population is probably rather lower than it is at present. Because as people get more prosperous, they want more space, etc. And so let's hope that the peak is achieved by, say, 2040, and then it starts going down.
As an alternative to mass die-out, one of the things that you suggest in the book as a way to limit our impact individually, interestingly, is basically fashion. I'm paraphrasing, but you look to influencers, I think, online as a force for rebadging things like 4x4s. You use the phrase Chelsea tractors as tacky.
Yes, yes.
Am I right? Am I understanding that right? That you see a role for fashion in turning mass consumerism off extravagance?
Yes, I mean, it may not be enough, because to take two past examples, I mean, the stigma of drunken driving was increased by social pressure, and smoking, of course, similarly. So, I quoted sort of extravagant use of fossil fuels, like Chelsea tractors and patio heaters and all that, could be made to seem naff rather than stylish. And of course, the influence of the mass media is very important in this, and also influences on the internet. So I think that this can certainly help if people follow leaders who are aware of these concerns. So I think that's helpful. Going back to population, of course, the one other uncertainty is if there was an extension of the average lifespan. As you know, there's some research being done on whether aging is a disease that can be cured, or whether and the extent to which we can increase the maximum lifespan. If that happened, that would be a huge social disruption, and of course a massive new inequality if it was available only to wealthy people and not to the rest. So that's a social problem we might have to worry about one day, which would affect population.
Okay, we've got hands going up, as they always do towards the end. I'm sorry, I'll have to go behind you, at the back, under the tortoise, and then I'll come to you on the sofa. Yes, what's your name?
Thank you. My name is David Martin.
Hi.
Yeah, just on that point, I'm a partner at a trend firm. So we're looking really not at the long-term future. We're looking at, as J.G. Ballard said, the next 5 minutes. We're tracking trends in consumerism. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things we say to clients at the moment is that one of the big things we're saying to them right now is that eco-consumption, sort of a more sustainable, ethical consumption, is on a very interesting journey, we think, from a badge of status to a matter of shame. So if you look even 10, 15 years ago, eco-consumerism, more sustainable consumerism was like a status badge. Like, look at me, am I not a very enlightened consumer? Look at my Tesla, you know, we should all be proud of me. Now it's actually becoming a matter of social shame. It's less about the status if you do it, it's more about the social shame if you don't do it. And going back to some of your points before, we say that that's being driven by two big things. The first big thing is charismatic leaders like David Attenborough and Greta. The second big thing is innovation, which you touched on as well, like when eco-alternatives become as affordable and mainstream and as good often as the legacy alternative, like the Impossible Burger, then why wouldn't you choose it? And then if you don't choose it, it becomes a matter of social shame. And I just wonder if that is going to be useful to us and useful to the politicians in helping them take action. And indeed, the big example I always use when I talk to clients who are not British, who don't remember those ads in the 80s, is social shame is such a powerful driver of behaviour change, even more powerful than status. And we had these amazing ads in the 80s that turned drink driving into a matter of profound shame. And maybe we think the same is happening with sustainable consumerism, and you need to do something about it. That's our message to them.
I think so. Well, that's one optimistic thought for the evening. Yes.
There are many more in the book. Yes, what were you going to say?
First, I suppose about to add to that point, which is that...
Sorry, what's your name?
My name's David. Just on that point, there was a famous campaign in the, I think, 70s or 80s about HIV, the famous Tombstone advert, which did initially reduce the rate of HIV. Very big frightening things, this will kill you, there is no cure, but actually it never wiped out HIV and we still have it. It's not the disease it once was, but it didn't really have the effects that it was supposed to. The point I was going to make was possibly if you're being overly pessimistic about the impact of an epidemic or even a pandemic, because if you look at the current coronavirus outbreak, the genome was sequenced quite quickly, relatively speaking, and probably would have been sequenced a lot faster had the Chinese government been more open about the whole thing. And we're already developing a vaccine, and any future terrorist effort would probably be based on the flu virus, to which we would have an even faster response, given we already have mechanisms and factories in place to manufacture a vaccine, just because there's a flu outbreak every year, which itself kills more people than the coronavirus currently has and spreads faster. But also, sort of, to give a caveat to that, I've seen a memorable case in Leeds where I trained, where there was a MERS-positive patient who was left in the waiting room with 3 pregnant ladies, and the infection measures in many hospitals in London haven't been much better from what I've seen. So there is that. But
what happened to the pregnant ladies?
Never found out. I assume they were okay because I never heard anything about it, and there wasn't an outbreak, so it's probably okay. But and of course, it's not that people are being slack about it, it's just that the resources, the masks and the infection control measures are expensive, and there are only a limited amount of side rooms per ward to put patients, and when you have a massive outbreak, you know, it's difficult to control these kind of things. But also, just because of the speed of response, and especially the efforts by the World Health Organization and the speed that the government already have protocols to put into play with producing vaccines for flu. I wonder if you are being possibly overly pessimistic about this.
Well, I was trying not to be, and I agree. We've got no evidence yet that this new epidemic is worse than the average annual flu, I think, honestly. So we don't know. But nonetheless, we know about the Spanish flu in 1919, and there are concerns. And of course, I would worry about my point that there can be social breakdown. I mean, if we go back to the SARS epidemic, luckily it was in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Toronto, all places which could cope with it, and so it had a major economic impact, but it didn't kill huge numbers of people. I mean, had it gone to say Mumbai or Lagos, where they couldn't have coped with it, then the body count could have been much, much higher. So I think that was a lucky escape, and as you say, that was made possible by careful planning and monitoring. And so the monitoring, as the first quote you gave from my book, the monitoring what happens, and particularly these transmissions from animals to humans. That's very important. But I don't want to be too scary about pandemics, but I do think that a pandemic doesn't have to kill half the world's population in order to be a catastrophe because of the runaway breakdown of social order.
The flag's gone up. I'm going to use my remaining time not so much to sum up as be very selfish and ask a question on a different subject, because your book, like your mind, covers the very big, the very small, the very old, the very new, the very dismal, the very hopeful. You also get into cosmology because that's your thing. So what happened? Okay, you say that one of the big challenges for 21st century physics is to go right back to the Big Bang and the trillionth of a nanosecond after that. But I want to know what happened before that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us in a
Well,
sentence?
you have to wait a bit, but let me just say that when I was a student, which was 50 years ago, we didn't know there had been a Big Bang at all. There was what's called a steady state theory, which was Fred Hoyle and others. Now we know there was a Big Bang, and we can map out its properties with a few % precision all the way back to a billionth of a second, or nanosecond. That's immense progress. But of course, as always in science, each advance brings into focus a new set of questions which couldn't have been posed before. And of course, the big question now is what happened within that first nanosecond. And a lot did, because that's, and the reason that's a mystery is that during that time, the physical conditions were far more extreme than we can simulate in any experiment. All the particles are moving more energy than the LHC accelerator in CERN can produce. So the physics is uncertain. But many key things about the universe were surely imprinted back in that initial few instants. The way it's expanding, the contents of particles, dark matter, etc., and the embryos from which galaxies formed, they're all imprinted very early on. And we have lots of ideas about that. But we have no foothold in experiment, and therefore the ideas are still speculative. But I think for the next 50 years, I'm hopeful we'll have theories which will gain credibility because we can test them in other ways, which will allow us to answer the sorts of questions. I mean, I think what had before the Big Bang is maybe too simple a question because... Well,
am I the only person in the room who wants to know?
No, I'll tell you. But the reason is that what almost certainly happens is that space and time get screwed up. So you can't talk about alongside versus before and after. So you're going to talk about before if you've got a clock ticking away, which you don't have. So that's one thing. But I'll tell you, the thing that fascinates me most is whether there were many Big Bangs and not one.
Yeah.
That's another question we don't know. Is there what's called the multiverse?
Can we ask Sir Martin to come back and talk about entanglement?
Yes, that'll be a long lecture.
Very interesting what's
I know, yes, but I think what we would like to know is were there other Big Bangs and were their aftermaths different from ours? And just to say why this is important, we had the Copernican revolution itself, and then we've had two more. We've realised that our galaxy is one of many. And we've also realised, this is a very exciting thing, that our solar system is one of billions, because we know that most stars in the sky have planets around them. So we've had 3 revolutions, and we may have a 4th and even grander one, that not only is our solar system not the only one, our galaxy not the only one, maybe our Big Bang is not the only one. So physical reality could be vastly greater. And this is a big speculation. Some physicists foam at the mouth when you talk about this. They say it's too crazy. But I'll just finish with an anecdote which comes from the book, which is that I was at a conference where the chairman asked the speakers, on the scale, would you bet your goldfish, your dog, or your life how much would you bet on the multiverse? And I said I was nearly at the dog level. And the other person on the panel was someone called Linde, who spent 25 years working on the theory of the multiverse. And he said he'd almost bet his life on it. And then Steven Weinberg, a famous theorist, he said he'd happily bet Martin Rees' dog and Andre Linde's life on the multiverse.
Well, look, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's pitched in. David on the imminent shortage of lead. Chris on hydrogen. That's something that we need to spend a whole hour on. Yep. Martin on everything from the Big Bang to the distant future. James, one of many Jameses, you're so right that we're confronted with hypernationalism. I like that phrase, when what we need is international cooperation. I think it's the first time we've ever had Dan Brown cited as an authority, or perhaps merely an inspiration for thought about what to do with pandemics. But Malthus certainly entered the room on that occasion. Fascinated, David, by your advice to clients on the next 5 minutes, and I'd love to know more about how you measure your evidence that you present to them. But mainly, Martin, thank you very much for coming and unburdening yourself on so many different subjects. Thank you very much.
Thank you.